Hello and welcome to lesson 2 of week 3. In this lesson, we are going to look at the margin and the padding properties in CSS. My name is Mildred. In the last lesson, we created this container. We looked at the height and the width property, and we also looked at how we can create a border around an element. Now we want to look at the margin property. The margin is the space that we have outside of the border. Everything here is the margin. Now we can see this container is almost at the end. Let's say we want to set something so this container leaves the edge and comes a little closer in there. We set the margin property using margin like this. This margin property is like the shorthand to set the margin for all sides. When we say margin is equal to 20 pixels, we refresh this and we see it shifts and it sets that margin on all sides of the element like that. So you can have from 1 to 4 values, and you can specify the first value that will apply to the top and bottom, and the second value that applies to the left and the right. So we can say we want the margin for the top and bottom to be 10 pixels, and then for the left and right to be 20 pixels like this, and when we refresh we have it resized. Okay, we can have 4 values, and the same thing we discussed in the last lesson, where the number of values you specify determines where each value applies to. All right, we can also center the container and set this margin to auto instead of having the pixels value for the margin property. And so when I refresh this, margin auto centers this element. But we can also do something like set the margin for individual sides. So we can have like the margin bottom property. So we'll say margin bottom, and then we set the value we want for just the bottom of the margin. We can have margin top, we can have margin left, and then margin right, and set values for each part. Whenever we have just the margin, it applies to all sides. So each side will have a margin of whatever we set. So I'm going to leave this margin as 50 pixels here. Then this space that is created is outside of the border. It does this between like the edge of your screen to the element, right? It sets the space. Now inside of the border, we have this text touching the edge of the border, and so we want to use the padding property to set the space around the content inside the border. And so we set a padding property like this. When we set the value of the padding to 10 pixels, this applies to all sides, left, right, top, bottom, because we used one value. We can set this value 1, 2, 3 or 4 values, and when we set it that way, it applies to different sides, just like we have discussed previously. All right, so we can set one value for top and bottom and another value for left and right. We can set value for each part using 4 values here, where we can say 5 pixels to apply to the top, 10 to apply to the right, 15 to apply to the bottom, 20 to apply to the left. So you can do it this way, having 4 values like that. And so when you have 3 values, you know that the first will apply to the top, the last to the bottom, and the middle one applies to the left and the right. So we want to refer to your lesson resource and our previous lesson to see when we have 1 to 4 values where the values apply to. You can have individual padding property like padding top, then you can have padding bottom, you can have padding left and padding right to apply to just one side of the element. Now we've looked at the height, the width, the border, the margin, and the padding. But why are these relevant in our design of a web page? All of these come to make up something we call the box model, and box model is very important for layout, for responsiveness, for us to calculate the total height and width of an element. And so when we place the element, this allows us to resize and allows us to build better responsive sites. There is a particular CSS property that is very important, and when you find a production ready site, you always see an asterisk like this. When you use an asterisk, it means apply this to every element on the web page. And what we normally put here is the box sizing property, something like this. This can take one of 2 values, either border box or content box. Content box is the default value. When you use content box, when you calculate the total height and width of an element, it only involves the content. It does not calculate the padding and the border in that calculation of the height and width. When you set it to border box, it now includes that in the calculation of the height and the width, which is important for layout. And so we always, when we want to start a responsive site that resizes according to your screen, we always start our CSS file with apply F to every element, box sizing property, and set the value to border box to make sure that the content, the padding, and the border values are calculated in the total height and the width, which will affect the layout, the placement, and how responsive the site is going to be. So you always want to have this first. So what is the box model? Every element in a web page is represented by a triangular box, whether we can see a border or not. When we have an element, there is a triangular box that exists. That box has the total height and width, and the content here is the actual text that we have. So this is the content, right? Around this content, the next thing we have is the padding. So we have the content, then we have the padding around it that creates the space around it. After the padding, then we have the next thing we have is the border. Outside the border, the next thing we have is the margin. All of this affects the total height and width of an element and also affects the layout. And because we want the padding and the border values to be calculated in the total height and width, that is why we set the box sizing property to border box. So how do we calculate the box model in CSS? Let's say we want to get the total height of an element, right? To get the total height for an element, when we want to do height, we use top and bottom, and when we want to use width, we do left and right. So when they say total height, we want to focus on the top and bottom values. So this height has one value, 250 pixels. When you want to calculate the total height, you look at the height of the element. The height here is 250 pixels. So put 250 plus. Now height is top and bottom. And then when we say width is left and right, you want to look at the border. What is the top border value and what is the bottom border value? So the border at the top is 5 pixels and the border at the bottom is 5 pixels. Now we want to look at the padding. Okay, the padding at the top is 5 pixels and the padding at the bottom is, so this is top, right, bottom is 15 pixels. So the margin property is not included here because everything stops at the border, and so this will now give you the total height of the element. For the total width of an element, we see the width is set to 300 pixels plus, now we're doing left and right. What is the value of the left border? 5 pixels, the right border 5 pixels, the left padding, the right is 10 pixels, and then the left is 20 pixels, and this will give you the total width of the element. And so this calculation of the box model is what we need and what makes it important for responsiveness and layout of our web page. So this is where we end this lesson. Next week we are going to go further in working with this container and looking at how we can do a proper layout on our web page when we have an element and we have containers, and how we can deal with when content here overflows the container. Thank you and see you next week.